Hello, Holy Trinity, and happy Thursday. I want to share with you a little bit more of a complex reflection today because our first reading at Mass today is somewhat complex, and it led to a conversation I had with a priest friend of mine about how we express things in the Catholic faith. So, for context, you're going to want to read the first reading from Mass today. It's from the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 8. Verses 1 through 13, and there's a couple of verses that were left out in the reading at Mass. But if you read that, you'll understand what I'm talking about. So if you haven't read that yet, I'd encourage you to just hit pause, find your Bible, read chapter 8 of St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Within this reading, he's talking specifically about, so for context, he's talking about eating meat sacrificed to idols. And his point is that knowing that idols aren't real gods, it really doesn't matter if somebody else, offered that meat to their false god. You can eat that meat. It's not going to hurt you because you know that that sacrifice didn't actually do anything to the meat. It just doesn't matter. However, those whose faith isn't as strong don't have that understanding that those false gods are false gods. And they think that, well, maybe all those false gods mean something, and maybe I really shouldn't eat this meat because it was sacrificed there. And St. Paul's, his ultimate point is, he understands that it's not a problem, but he's not going to make a huge point out of it if it's going to hurt somebody else's faith. Does that make sense? Like, he understands, but he knows that there are people who don't understand, and he also knows that if he eats meat sacrificed to idols, other people might be scandalized and worry about it. And he's like, well, that's something easy enough for me to give up, that I don't need to do that, even though it's actually okay to do. Now, when I was having a conversation about this with a priest friend of mine, we were talking about there's a fair number of things in our Catholic faith which make sense to those of us who study them and look at them closely, but can give a little bit of a little scandalous to other people. The prime example of that we were talking about is in the Creed, where we say, for us men and for our salvation. And the word men there is a translation of the Latin word hominum. Now, Latin has two different words that can translate as man. Hominum means human being, but it's most often translated as man. And that's what we're praying in the Creed. And so when we say that, we're talking about for men in the terms of human beings. For us human beings, it's a little more awkward to say human beings, but the word men in English has sort of like changed how it's understood. And it used to be able to be understood that way, now not so much. The translation is not the greatest, and who knows, maybe somewhere down the line, they'll retranslate it. Maybe, we'll see, I don't know. But there's also another word in Latin, vir, and that means specifically man, and the word for woman is mulier, which means specifically woman. That's not the one in the Creed. So, with the knowledge that I have gained and that now you have from listening to this video, it makes sense that we would be able to say that in the Creed. The problem is, not everybody has that knowledge. And so what do we do with that? There's a couple of different options. One is education, giving that knowledge to other people. And I imagine St. Paul in his time did his best to say, hey, look, guys, meat sacrificed to idols doesn't mean anything. It doesn't matter what somebody else did with that meat. You can eat it. That's okay. So there's education, but there's also, and St. Paul really encourages this, a gentleness, a not, throwing it in their faces, a willingness to do things a little differently, even though you're like, yeah, I know exactly what this is and why it is, but for the sake of people who don't necessarily know what we do and why we do it, I'm not going to make a big deal out of it. Another example that comes to mind right now is, eating or not eating meat on Fridays. The Catholic practice of not eating meat on Fridays, especially during Lent, I've had many people tell me this, priests who I trust. They say, if you're visiting somebody who doesn't know that's your practice and they just made meat for a meal on Friday, hospitality and eating what's put before you is more important than not eating the meat. And it's one of those things, like, don't force and cause problems because of something that you practice. It's a good practice, but don't let your practice and your understanding lead other people away from God rather than leading them to God. God bless you all. Love you all. Have a great Thursday, and keep praying for an end to the fires and that smoke will go away and that we all might be safe and healthy. God bless.